So let's ask you some questions.
Okay.
And before we do that, can you tell us who you are?
Nice to meet everyone. My name is Brian Malkerson. I'm the CRO of Attentive. We are a conversational marketing platform focusing on helping power SMS. We are headquartered in New York, so we started with a focus in the US about 5 years ago. We now work with about 5,000 to 6,000 brands in the US and recently opened an office here in London. And excited, we're working with about 100 brands here now in the UK. And I've been a big partner of Ometria and kind of seen their success in the US. And we actually met back in New York about a year ago, I guess. So excited to be here.
Well, thanks for coming. Good to see you in London. Very quickly, my name is Jalal, one of the co-founders of Ometria. I moved out to New York just over 2 years ago. Brian and I met there. And we've been working very closely with Attentive. It's been a great partnership, and most importantly, trying to understand what the future of e-commerce is going to look like, what the future of retail is going to look like. So we have a few questions prepared. Some of them were very last minute. And do you ever watch Craig Ferguson?
Do I have what?
Craig Ferguson, the talk show host.
Yeah.
Do you know how when the hosts come on, he has like cue cards that he rips up and throws away?
Oh yeah,
I feel like it's nearly what happened here, but we got some good questions. So before we go into the future of commerce, it would be great to understand what you've been seeing in terms of trends and challenges that most retail brands face today.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a very I think interesting and unique time right now. We've kind of gone through this number of trends over the last few years. One, obviously COVID and this big lockdown where consumer behavior changed very dramatically. And so, a number of brands and I think life, people have been changing and rethinking things. I moved from New York down to Miami during COVID and got a dog and did all of those things. But, you've kind of seen that play out quite a bit. And you've also seen, from a marketing perspective, a lot of moves towards things like privacy and things of that nature that, ultimately, when Apple and the iOS changes and that affects then like Facebook and Facebook marketing. And, when we talk to a lot of the brands that we work with, that's the stuff that they're thinking about is, hey, like from an acquisition perspective, either traffic is down or, hey, Facebook's telling them to focus on driving traffic but not conversion, so they're getting more traffic. They're getting the same amount of traffic, but they're not converting as much. And so how do they kind of evolve in that, in this kind of like new landscape? And then I think also even on the, on the inventory side, obviously there's been a lot of changes from like supply chain that people have been trying to navigate. And I think, you're still seeing that with a lot of stuff that's going on in the world today. And so, it's, I think it's exciting and there's lots of new technologies and things. It's probably, never been more difficult to be a marketer in this environment.
Yeah, and I appreciate it's still an early journey for you guys in the UK and Europe. Do you see any major differences in terms of some of the trends and challenges that you've seen?
I think it's a lot of, similarity. I mean, I think at the end of the day, people are trying to drive higher customer lifetime value. I saw it in the Ometria insert for your top 7. And at the end, I was like, hey, this is not one of our top 7, because that's what everything kind of culminates to. And I think that's the same, regardless of which country or type of brand that you are. You want to be driving long-term customer value, right? It's first you're trying to get them, for new customers who aren't familiar with the brand, you're trying to get them exposed and to create that connection, and then obviously get them coming back and referring friends and creating, kind of that value over time. So I think that stays the same. Obviously, consumer behavior is can be different in how they want to interact with brands or be communicated to, can vary in different areas. I know when we came here, the first response, even when, Anoop, who actually heads up EMEA for us, who's here, his first response on people was, hey, people just do WhatsApp here. They don't do SMS. And I think there's a number of different kind of consumer behaviors, but in general, yeah, we see similar challenges, similar things that marketers are trying to focus on.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. One of the first shockers for me in the US was that literally everyone just texts each other. There's no WhatsApp, it's just SMS everywhere. And they're not scared to call you either. So it was just a very different way of communicating.
Yeah, I never know whether to text you or WhatsApp you, so it's...
Yeah, well, let's just call each other. It'll be easier. Thanks for that. Now into sort of the theme of Lifecycle. We've seen a lot of talks, discussions around sort of creating that customer experience. How do you think, based on what you've seen, you've been very much in the space in terms of how e-commerce has evolved to deliver those super relevant, super personalized, hyper relevant experiences?
Yeah, I think that, and I've obviously talked on one of the themes is just trying to create that, at the end of the day, you want to create that connection with different consumers, right? And do it in an authentic way. Dove's obviously been a good example of a brand that's been able to do that over time. But I think there's this almost like paradox of choice now that consumers have, because there's so many options out there today, so many different brands, so many different touch points, and on the marketing side, you have all of these different places you can potentially sell. Traditionally, it was just primarily brick and mortar, and then it was online, and now you can sell on social channels, and there's a variety of them trying to get you to create experiences there, but also to your own website, or it could be wholesaler through partners, and then finding all the different channels and the way to communicate with them. And so as all of those options kind of proliferate, right, or even on Amazon, which could be a whole talk in of itself, as all of those proliferate, how do you make sure that you communicate with customers and engage with them in the way that they want, right? Because it's not really about what the brand wants. It's like, how do they want to communicate with you? But do it in a way that it doesn't feel siloed, and it's not separate, where somebody's like, hey, I just gave you this information here, and now you're asking for it or showing me something completely different. But not to the point where it feels like it's almost intrusive, right? Like, I think a lot of people are familiar themselves or have seen that experience where you talk about something to a friend, or you're going on some trip, and you happen to have your phone nearby, and all of a sudden you're getting YouTube videos and Facebook ads about it, and you're like, I haven't told anyone else that. And so I think in that world, it becomes very important to be able to pull all of that together, which, again, I think is why, from our perspective, when we really focus on mobile as a channel and how do we make a great experience there, we've had such a good experience working with Ometria and your customers, because you guys kind of started there, right? I mean, is how do you pull in all these new channels and data and make sure it's a good unifying experience?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, when we started just over 9 years ago, that was still super early days, and now it's definitely at the forefront of every single communication that we have, or every single conversation we have with the brand. And what we see quite a lot in the market is around sort of 3 major challenges, which ultimately have impacted the way e-commerce has evolved. And one of them is enabling the marketing team to be able to not only understand the data, but actually to use that data to orchestrate the communications across all the channels that you've mentioned. On that trend, how do you see Attentive working more with the marketing teams rather than sort of the overall e-commerce brands? And how do you see sort of marketers using the technology to then ensure the hyper-relevant experience?
Yeah, it's something we think about quite a bit. I think, look, still in the US even, I'd say 60% of brands that we work with are doing SMS for the first time. Here, it's more similar to what we saw 40 years ago in the US, where it's probably 95%. And so very early on, we're actually just focused on the core. How do you get people to opt in and do it in a compliant way, in a way that's a good consumer experience? And so really growing that list, focusing on the compliance, getting all of kind of the core stuff set up that I think people don't necessarily take for granted, but don't really think about in other more mature channels like email. And then as it starts scaling, then I think that's where it becomes a really important conversation, and that's where it's, okay, we don't want to have a siloed platform where we're having to recreate certain types of segments or their audience enrichment, and so, how do we bring that information in to create those conversations, from like an Ometria. And so a lot of it is being able to pull in that data, through our partners and make sure that we make that really easy and seamless for both the marketer as well as the consumer. But also I think in this new world, as I alluded to earlier, the type of data that you can get and bring in has evolved. I think there was a lot of, thank you. We practiced this out in the hallway.
This was practiced many, many times.
And so, I think a lot of it you had, one, lived in either like third-party data, right? We traditionally have to purchase that data, and or it lived on like a platform like Facebook, right? Which you were kind of reliant on for acquisition, and a lot of times even retargeting or re-engagement. And now with a lot of the changes from different browsers, from iOS, you have GDPR out here. There's just this movement more and more towards away from like third-party data or third-party cookie data, and to really more kind of first and now what people call zero-party data. I usually don't do like kind of the show of hands thing, but can anyone raise your hand if you're not 100% sure what zero-party data means versus first-party? 2 honest people, 3, okay, wait for more. And so, even at dinner last night we were chatting about this, and I think I inserted I found this online that I thought was kind of funny, kind of explaining it, which was zero-party data is where somebody's actually giving you that information, and can be like in a survey, an online pop-up or something like that, where they're explicitly answering something. And then first-party data is, their purchase behavior, their browsing behavior, stuff they're doing on your site, so you kind of own that data, but it's not like they're explicitly giving that to you. And then second party can be from like a partner, and then like third party is like just like purchase data that's like aggregated from some third party. And so it's funny though, because from a consumer perspective, and even going back to some of the examples I said before, when you're talking about something and Facebook is listening, like how consumers, so you have like the whole regulatory side of things, and also these, the Apples of the world that kind of, and Googles that kind of dictate a lot of this. But then also just as consumers and their expectation, what they feel comfortable with over time. I think Jalal asked me, like, am I the person who says yes to everything? And like, what is your then expectation? And I typically say yes. I mean, obviously I'm not, working in this space. I wouldn't say I'm like a good typical consumer. But yeah, I'm like, yeah, if I'm happy giving that information, but then I think, you talked about us having an expectation for, if I'm giving that information, I want to have a better experience, right? And I don't know how many people go in even when they're on social platforms and they're like, why are you seeing this ad? And you actually go in, and I'm like one of those people that go in and tell them, like, this is why I don't want to see this ad anymore, or show me this type of ad. But, I think people are kind of evolving to having that kind of expectation. And I think that being able to capture that information and be in control of that is super important, especially in this world now where I think from, acquisition is still going to be really important, but I think owned channels, being able to bring back customers to drive even acquisition from your existing customer base, whether it's referrals or other sources, is going to be more and more important. And so from a zero-party data perspective, in fact, we have a shared customer with Ometria called Just Hype. If you go to their website, when we serve their capture unit to opt in for email and then SMS, we ask them their preference, and so they can say like, what are they interested? What types of items are they interested in? And it's always a trade-off between trying to collect that information, doing it at the right time, and not wanting to ruin your conversion rate or increase your bounce rate. And so how you ask for it and when you ask for it can be obviously really important. And mixing that in with other data that might be more inferred or more kind of first or second party data.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think our branding teams had a heart attack when we put the slide together. That's one. And two, I see like three categories of consumers, probably more, but in terms of the data side, there are ones that they're scared of giving data. They don't want to give any data whatsoever. There are ones that are kind of neutral. They click on all the yeses, all the cookies, all the allow preferences, all of that stuff. And then there are the third group that I think you and I fall into, where we want to give brands our preferences, but I think the biggest disconnect is when brands don't use those preferences, the zero-party data, to then actually personalize the experience, and then you get even more pissed off.
Yeah.
How do you see brands actually improving, one, the collection of that zero-party data to then actually using that data? Because I mean, most of the brands that I interact with, the number one channel or source to collect zero-party data is through the preference center, right? Do you see that evolving in any way, and how do you see sort of brands leveraging that in a better way?
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously I have a little bit of a bias around the channels that we focus on, SMS, but I think that's been one of the most powerful things for channels like SMS that have really high engagement, and I think people acknowledge is more of a personal channel. And so I think like the preference center, which is I think traditionally where everyone would kind of go to. I don't know about other people in this room, but I very rarely go to the preference center. If I do, it's only because I'm more like frustrated or upset, and I'm like, how do I turn this off? It's not usually like in a positive experience. But something like SMS, where you're very used to responding to things, it's very natural to have a post-purchase survey where you can get like an NPS score, or if there's some sort of transactional or shipping or other experience, or hey, they have a customer service issue. There's a lot of these different customer journey experiences or different points around that journey where you can easily capture an asset data in a way that feels very authentic and natural. And then, I think the key part though is to make sure, you're using that data. Because I think sometimes it's easy to just say, okay, we should be capturing this, so let's do it. But like at the end of the day, I think everyone should kind of have a plan of, okay, well, what are we going to do with that? Or have some sort of response. If somebody has a low score, then you kind of have a response, hey, well, like, would you mind chatting with someone or filling out this follow-up, or really sorry to hear that, or using that data in some sort of segmentation in the future. And I think if you just say, hey, how are we going to capture the data, but don't have a plan to really how to implement that in a way that's beneficial for the consumer, then you're probably, creating more work and more confusion on both sides.
Yeah. I know there are a few very interesting slides on a piece of research that you guys did. And before we jump into that, I think the few brands here do have physical stores, and the overall physical brick and mortar experience have changed quite a lot over the last few years and will continue changing. But I would love to get your thoughts on what you see sort of the future of brick and mortar is, what technologies are impacting the evolution of brick and mortar, and how basically consumers will interact with online and offline channels.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, and I think for us, we work with a lot of big retailers. We also work with a ton of e-com only, and then ones I think that are kind of somewhere in the middle. And for me, a lot of it comes back to also going back to the whole COVID thing, which is tough not to go back to, even though we're all kind of looking forward. I think a lot of the data and a lot of people are seeing is this whole like bounce back, right, to like the trends. I'm sure a lot of people have seen those articles or graphs where we saw this huge bump in either consumers spending time on their phones or purchase or whatever that was, and then maybe some drop to where it was back to whatever that previous cycle was, right, where e-commerce has been growing, mobile's been growing, and then was certain things kind of more of a one-time change we saw over the last 18 months, and is that going back to a normal trend? And then also understanding what behavior is going to be different. I think it was like yesterday, the day before, I saw something where, companies, and how does that affect different companies like Peloton, which obviously was a huge benefactor of the trends we saw during COVID, as no one was wanting to go into gyms, and now almost everyone has gone back to gyms, who were going to gyms before, like a very high percentage, but from an office perspective, it's like half that, right? And so, is the future of people where they work, are they going to be working from home or hybrid or remote? I'm sure almost everyone in this room is having those conversations and probably even deciding on the current or future, where they want to work based on those. But I think that is very much up in the air, and that's really evolving. And you hear Brian Chesky, the CEO of Airbnb, talk about it, and he thinks it's not hybrid or like traditional. It's going to be these like communal experiences where you find time to get everyone together, and like hybrid doesn't necessarily work, or just going back to the way things were before. Personally, I think it'll vary depending on the industry and the type of office and a variety of things. But you see that, I think, where shoppers are now going back and spending time in stores, which obviously they weren't before. What I think has been great about it is that a ton of retailers that I think in the past were really slow to kind of adopt or to get buy-in at their organization to make big changes are now like, okay, everything's on the table now. And so you've seen a lot of these new ideas and things pop up. And so how that's being weaved back in as people start going back in store. Obviously a big trend from e-commerce brands, which I know there's a lot of those here. Like in the US, brands like Warby Parker that started out online only, and then they started building out their store footprint, as some of it for showrooming, some of it for other purposes. And I think you'll start seeing more and more of that again, where e-commerce brands are now probably looking at different, whether it's pop-up shops or other ways to potentially build retail experiences. And you're starting to see a lot of them start looking at that again, as they try and find other growth and other ways to engage with the consumer.
Yeah.
Yeah. And buy online, pick up in store too. I think the convergence of the two things, that's been a big focus as well, and making sure that's a great experience. Because a lot of consumers, maybe they want to go in and look at different items, and it's more of the browsing experience. Some of them want to do the browsing experience on their phone, right? Some of them want it delivered really quickly. Some of them want to be able to go pick it up and have that immediate experience. I know Bonobos, they have that where they you couldn't even buy stuff in their stores. You just go in and try it on, and you could only ship it. And so it's been interesting to see a lot of the experimentation there, and how that's evolved.
Yeah, and the convergence of the two sort of online and offline worlds bring the emphasis on data even more. How do you see sort of technologies evolving, right? Because as you said, some of the traditional sort of discovery experiences, you go into a physical store, you look at the products, etc. Now you do a lot of that in the online world, and there's been a lot of technologies in terms of VR, AR, and experiential technologies. How do you see any genuine technology facilitating that link between the online and the offline world?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we're actually focused on, we acquired a company about a year ago. We call it Attentive Concierge, where we try and if you think about shopping in a store, you typically have this retail associate who's there to help answer questions. And when you look online, especially on mobile, there's a really high abandoned cart rate, right? So people come in, they either browse or they add to cart, and then they tend to abandon at a very high rate. Or they buy stuff now, and I was listening to another talk yesterday about someone who was saying, hey, people initially, especially when everyone started buying stuff online, AOV is going up, they're buying 3 or 4 items, but a lot of times it's because even if they were going to purchase, they weren't sure about the size, the color, the fit, so they just buy a bunch of things knowing that they're going to return a bunch. And so you would look at the ROI of your marketing program, and you're like, wow, this is great, but in reality, a lot of that was going to get returned, and then there was real costs associated with that. And so, one thing we try to do is create this journey where you have a live agent that can jump in and answer questions about those things to help to help reduce those questions around either fit or other policies that someone might have. I think also you mentioned AR, VR. I've seen, we work with some furniture companies in the US. They immediately started doing this almost virtual showrooming where they were initially just with iPhones going in, and you could actually see it. Other ones will do it where you have the app and you can actually project it in your apartment or house, what have you. So you can really understand that experience, and a lot of it is just bringing that traditional in-store brick and mortar type of feeling, but be able to do it with the convenience of doing it in your living room or wherever you're doing that browsing or buying behavior.
We have 5 minutes left, so let's pick. I have one question that I definitely want to ask you towards the end, and I have a mini announcement to make, and then let's. I mean, I know there's this piece around the research that you guys did, so maybe we can combine the two together.
Yeah.
So one about, you've talked about all these new channels popping up. A lot of them are great in theory. In practice, they don't work. You've had incredible success with SMS, and ultimately there's this whole conversational commerce piece now starting to become a trend. So we'd love to get your thoughts on that, and then I'll ask you one more question. And by the way, if you want me to go into the stats,
it's a polite way of saying we have 5 minutes before we're getting kicked off the stage. So yeah, I think on the conversational commerce piece, it's a few things. One, as we've saw this shift, and so a number of us had worked at Twitter before Attentive, and then when we were there, we saw this big shift towards consumers spending time on mobile devices, obviously in general, but then a lot of traffic was coming there because a ton of it's driven by social. People tend to be on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook on their mobile device. A lot of times they're opening email even on their mobile device. And so you're seeing all this traffic going towards mobile. And I think as trying to evolve and kind of go where the consumer is, we saw mobile messaging as a good way to communicate with those consumers, kind of where they were spending a lot of their time. But I think the natural inclination, or even a lot of the initial conversations we had, someone would say, oh, okay, well, we're doing this for email or something else. SMS is just some extension of that, or like, hey, if they don't open this email, then let's send them an SMS. But in reality, the expectations for consumers and the way that they use that channel is very different, right? The time decay between an email and SMS is completely different, right? You tend to see an SMS immediately, like it pops up on your phone. Most people don't see emails until much later, or like they'll have multiple different inboxes. Also, it's the medium of itself of what you can send. The size of that communication is very different. And then the expectation, I think, that it is conversational, right? Because I think it's very tempting to say, okay, well, we do something else from like a marketing perspective. Let's see if we can just put it there, because we're all super busy and have a lot of stuff going on. But the reality is, if you try and force that versus say, hey, like this is a channel that people want to communicate with, you're not really tapping into the power of that channel by not really focusing on that. And also, again, going into when people are shopping online, and all of those questions they have are the things that lead them either to not make that purchase or to make multiple purchases in return. You can have those conversations and get that feedback. And it can be a lot of times great experiences too, like shipping notification, like, hey, like who doesn't get excited to know when they've bought something and they get that notification or that message that, hey, your item's about to be here. Or if you just have a quick conversation, want to see something that you can quickly engage. Like even for customer service, I used to always be that person who was on the phone and calling and doing those things. Now I'm like, I'd much rather message with someone. I don't want to sit there and wait for 30 minutes, or if it's an airline now, 4 hours and 30 minutes. We're seeing a huge move towards conversational commerce. And I think areas where we're seeing and investing in is not just being able to have that conversation, but are working with some of the e-commerce platforms to enable being able to purchase via, in that mobile messaging or that SMS discussion. So if somebody's helping and answering questions, then they can just boom and they can transact right within the channel.
No, thanks for that. And we've talked a lot about SMS, and of course, US in terms of SMS, as we've briefly discussed, is not necessarily more advanced, but it's more ahead in terms of the consumer expectation, but also the adoption there. Any things, we have 1 minute 30, I'm going to ask you a question, but anything you want to highlight from these?
I think, look, the reason why we came originally to the UK when we did is because we had a number of multinational brands, who had a big presence here, and they were really pushing for it. And so we said, look, if we build it, let's see what that actually engagement looks like, because it's not a given, right, that consumers are going to adopt a new channel, and especially when they use SMS here very differently than they do in the US. And so the big things that we look at, one is, are people opting into a channel, right? Because if somebody doesn't want to opt in, then it doesn't matter. You can't grow the actual channel because it has to be an explicit opt-in for SMS. Two, are they opting out? So are they having a negative experience? Do they not want to hear from the brand? Because even if they sign up, they're opting out right away. And then 3, we look at, are they engaging? So they actually seeing the messages, clicking on it. And then after that, is there are they converting, right? Because otherwise it's not good quality traffic. Surprisingly, almost all of the stats are higher than they are in the US. And again, it's still early, but I think, look, we did a bunch of initial survey data to understand how people were using it, and again, felt very similar to 4 or 5 years ago in the US when no one thought consumers were going to want to communicate with brands with SMS. But yeah, I've been shocked at how how well that we've seen it perform, particularly in the early days. And I think it's fine as like a prediction of commerce, and I'd love to hear your view on this. But,
sorry, I was accelerating through all the slides.
Yeah, no, I think look, as I mentioned before, I think a lot of it will be we had this crazy time period, hopefully once in our generation, where over the last 18 months, so many different changes in consumer behavior and then that trickled down to marketing and other brand strategies that we had to do. And now, after you've had all those experiments, as well as kind of life going back more to normal, which ones of those are going to be actually super important? And so, I think, if I had a prediction for the future of commerce, just continuing to evolve around being this more personalized experiences and connecting with consumers, where they're spending their time, and as that's evolving to these new platforms, being able to make sure that you can meet them there and have those conversations. But curious what.
Yeah, no, thanks. First of all, thank you, Brian. That was great. I'm sure there'll be many more questions. I'm already over time, but my one prediction. I mean, they're the usual sort of your vanilla ones in terms of everything coming together, data. But one, and I've mentioned this many times. I actually haven't mentioned it to you, but the Fortnite thing, and I still find it fascinating. I already mentioned it to a few people, but so we talk about the whole metaverse thing that's going to be in the future, 5-10 years. It's actually here now. This stat is still shocking to me that maybe I'm just getting too old, but this stat is shocking where Fortnite makes anywhere between sort of say 2 to 5 billion a year in terms of revenue, depending on the year it is, and about also there has been 60 to 80% of that is actually spent on digital clothes. So people today are actually spending money on clothes that they'll never be able to wear in real life. And that's how you see sort of brands like Balenciaga, Moncler, Nike, starting to partner with sort of Web3, the future of sort of the metaverse technologies, to create some sort of partnership where the physical is really in line with the online world. So I think that stat is absolutely mind-blowing, and the fact that people are spending $200-300 on a digital T-shirt is fascinating. So I think there's going to be a very important shift in consumer behavior around that.
Yeah, the last thing I'd say on that, just because Ivan knows I'm a very big Web3 or NFT enthusiast, but I didn't want to make this chat just about that. But yeah, I think I was trying to explain it to somebody the other night, which I didn't do, and I was like, did you collect cards? Did you do this? But look, at the end of the day, there is this whole new generation that is growing up in this even more digital first world than I think a lot of us have grown up in. And the idea of ownership, or the idea of what does that look like and where they want to show off what they're buying, is now more and more in these digital worlds. And I think what does that look like? And you mentioned Nike, they're probably at the forefront of this. They acquired this platform, Artifact, which is probably one of the top Web3 developers, and they do some really cool, interesting stuff where you can actually, and they're combining that digital to real life, where now you can actually get them by owning the NFT and then creating with the NFT, that you can then actually, they'll send you a real version of those shoes. So I think it is very early in that space, but yeah, I think as more and more becomes these new digital worlds and creating more digital goods, it'll be very interesting to see how brands kind of cross over there.
Definitely. Once again, Brian, thank you so much. My quick announcement is that no one can leave this room for the next half an hour. There are bouncers everywhere. No coffee, just water, whatever you on the tables. We have 3 very important questions. One of them is continuing based on what we've discussed in terms of if you were to make one prediction for the future of commerce, what would it be? The other 2 questions on the slides. Hope you guys have a very productive discussion. Half an hour, 25 minutes, given Brian and I were very late. But once again, Thank you so much. Hope you guys enjoyed, and look forward to the roundtable discussions. Thank you.